Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Khawar Qureshi, who's a Queen's Counsel, and who'll be speaking about the legal and practical implications of the Saudi-led sanctions, in inverted commas, on Qatar. We're especially grateful that Professor Qureshi has taken time from his busy schedule to be with us. Indeed, he only just landed in Singapore a few hours ago from the long flight from London. So we appreciate you being here very much. And before I introduce him, I just want to say a few words by way of introduction, just to emphasize how well placed Professor Qureshi is to speak on this subject. He's been practicing commercial and international law from Serle Court Chambers in London and from McNair Chambers in Qatar for many years. Indeed, McNair Chambers was one of the first barristers' chambers to be established outside of the United Kingdom. He's also one of the most experienced practitioners in his field, having appeared in many arbitrations all over the world and advising on complex commercial and international law matters for or against some 70 states, including the United States, Russia, India, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Qatar, Argentina, and Italy. Professor Qureshi is also famous for being one of the youngest advocates to appear before the International Court of Justice in the 1993 genocide case between Bosnia and Serbia-Montenegro, and he's currently counsel for Pakistan before the same court in the Jadav spy case. And I think some of you who might be interested in some of these other cases he's been involved with can also ask you questions on that if you'd like. So Professor Qureshi will have about 45 minutes to speak, and after that he'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, Assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure for me to join you here. I'd like to start by thanking the Middle East Institute of the university, but particularly Dr. Katan for inviting me to join you. The subject that I'm addressing is a subject that isn't simply confined to the situation of Qatar. It perhaps is an indication of changes that are taking place on the international landscape and may have profound consequences for the rule of law more broadly. There is a very detailed handout which I understand will be provided to you. Is that right, Victor? And there's a 60-page PowerPoint presentation, which, again, you should be able to access if you so wish. I'm not going to go through the PowerPoint presentation. What I propose to do is to give you an overview. And I'll start with what are sanctions. Then I'll address the measures against Qatar. There I'll take you through the slides and the legal responses on the part of Qatar. I make it clear that I'm not here to advance any particular point of view, express my own personal view. There's no particular agenda. The facts, I would suggest, are very clear, and all of you can make up your own minds about what the situation is. So we'll deal with, to begin with, what are sanctions? Now, in the title, I put sanctions in quotes because it's far from clear that the measures purportedly adopted on the 5th of June 2017 can be described as sanctions. They've been called sanctions, they've been called an embargo, they've been called a blockade. And terminology does matter because at the level of contracts, commercial contracts, supply of goods, supply of services, shipping contracts, contracts for construction, there are often clauses which can be invoked to limit or exclude liability, and the clauses are very clearly defined. The concept under common law, which is the law that exists in Singapore, and also reflected in the Qatar Civil Code, of force majeure, circumstances beyond the control of the parties, but they must be stipulated in the contract as circumstances which excuse further performance or suspend performance. There you will find that the language used is extremely relevant. So whether you describe a series of events as a blockade or an embargo or sanctions could impact upon whether a party has to continue to perform its contract or the contract is suspended. But for present purposes, what's important to know is that sanctions, properly called, are capable of being applied, in essence, in three ways generally. The first is pursuant to the United Nations Charter, Chapter 7. Articles 39 to 41 empower the Security Council in response to a threat or to the peace, breach of the peace, threat to international peace and security, to impose sanctions, measures short of the use of force. And that's been done on many occasions. You will recall the sanctions that were imposed upon Iraq after the invasion of Kuwait, Resolution 687 of August 1990, which then was supplemented or enhanced on the basis that the economic sanctions had failed, and then we had a military intervention. You will recall that Iran, until very recently, was the subject of UN, US, and EU sanctions. Those sanctions were lifted within the EU and the UN, but as many of you are aware, the US has imposed unilateral sanctions. So the starting point is that for sanctions to be admissible within the context of the international legal framework, they ought to come from the United Nations Security Council. And then those sanctions are reflected in regional bodies such as the European Union. Unusually, the United States, the president no less, through the exercise of executive powers, can also impose sanctions. And as I mentioned, that's been done by Donald Trump with regards to Iran. And I have to stop myself from saying anything that would indicate whether those sanctions are sound or not. But suffice to say that the rest of the European Union, indeed most of the world, doesn't agree with what Donald Trump has done on this occasion. And perhaps this occasion is not the only one that most of the world doesn't agree with him. But that's the background for sanctions. So let's see what's happened so far as Qatar is concerned. Now, bear in mind that in the context of sanctions imposed by the United Nations, the sanctions can be challenged and have been challenged before the English courts and also in the European Court. Two cases. There's a case called Ahmed versus the Treasury 2010. It was the first case of our new Supreme Court. And our Supreme Court held that even United Nations sanctions have to be based upon evidence. And if they're not based upon evidence, they can be struck down. Similarly, the European Court of Justice in two cases, a case called Bank Malat involving an Iranian bank, and a case called Qadi involving a Saudi national who was alleged to be affiliated to Al-Qaeda, the European Court of Justice struck down the sanctions on the basis that there wasn't an evidential basis. So even at that level, there is what's known as judicial review, and our courts in England and in the European Court of Justice have demanded that there must be an evidential basis for sanctions. In the United States of America, we won't go into the reasons why, on the very same facts in the Qadi case, whilst the European Court of Justice upheld the challenge to the sanctions, the American court maintained the sanctions. So what are the measures that have been taken against Qatar? You can see. On the 5th of June 2017, now I know because, as was mentioned by Victor, we have an office in Qatar. The first barristers' chambers was established in Qatar by myself and some colleagues. And this is a matter I became aware of very early on the 5th of June 2017. And I have to declare, I was advising on this at the very outset. But what happened? You had expulsion of diplomats. You had expulsion of Qatari nationals. Closure of airspace. Immediate closure of airspace. Closure of territorial waters. You had a land border blockade. And it didn't stop there. You had Al Jazeera offices being closed in Saudi Arabia. You had Qatar Airways offices being closed. You had postal services from the UAE to Qatar being suspended. Publication of a list of alleged terrorists that Qatar was allegedly supporting. Just a list. Up until now, there's been no evidence in support of this allegation. You had obstruction of pilgrims, Qatari pilgrims who were trying to engage in pilgrimage to Mecca. You had, last but by no means least, the Saudis deporting Qatari camels. Now, all of these measures met with an immediate response on the part of Qatar, and that was 5th of June 2017. You need to understand that, by and large, Qatar depended upon a great deal of material being supplied overland from Saudi Arabia for construction. And as its topography would suggest, the territorial waters that have to be navigated include those of the UAE, Bahrain, which is nearby. I haven't got a map, but if you could see, you'd see that on the other side of the waters is Iran, blocking access to airspace, blocking access to land traffic, blocking access to the territorial waters. Immediately and simultaneously, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE could have had a disastrous effect, but it didn't. And that's where you have to see how quickly the authorities in Qatar responded, because immediately they were able to open up an air corridor with the state proximate, namely Iran, and some of the sanctions, so-called, were eased, with the consequence that aircraft and ships which were traversing territorial waters and airspace that were not Qatari flagged were allowed to use territorial waters and airspace. But anybody who flies Qatar Airways, as I do very frequently, and I was in Kenya last week for a case, the journey to Kenya now goes all the way around as opposed to over Saudi airspace. What that achieves, well, you'd have to ask the Saudis, but in any event, these measures have been in place for more than a year and a half now. And there's been minor easing, but in substance they remain. Why? Because these are the demands that have been made of Qatar. 13-point list of demands made of Qatar by the group that is essentially headed by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain. A couple of other states have decided to join this little group. But what are the main demands? And you can see, curb diplomatic relations with Iran. Shut down Al Jazeera. Shut down news outlets that have been identified. Remove the Turkish presence on Qatari soil. Turkish troops came at the request of the Emir of Qatar to assist Qatar in the exercise of the right to self-defense, which is provided for in the UN Charter. Because there was, rightly or wrongly, a concern that there may be some activity in terms of a border incursion by troops from Saudi Arabia. And so I don't believe that anybody can argue that Qatar wasn't entitled to ask Turkey to send troops to assist in the event that there was such an attack and such an intervention. But it didn't happen. There's a list of alleged terrorists. Again, as I mentioned to you, there's no supporting evidence to identify why they're on the list. And you've got an insistence on stopping all contacts with political opposition groups in the states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain. Request 11, align itself with other Gulf and Arab countries militarily, politically, socially and economically, as well as on economic matters. Now, you may ask yourself, how does that impact upon the sovereignty of a state when a state is asked to do all of this? An independent state. And you may be aware of the fact that there is something called the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council, which is supposed to provide for greater alignment, harmonization. Doesn't seem to have worked very effectively so far in this situation, I'm afraid, but these are the demands that were made. And the response of Qatar was clear and unequivocal, that there was a clear aggression and an insult. What's the response from Qatar? This is a summary, and you can see that there's been a very clear response by Qatar at the diplomatic and legal level. So on the 31st of July 2017, Qatar filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization against the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. And that complaint is now being progressed. In September, the Human Rights Committee of Qatar established a compensation committee, which has received around 10,000 claims so far, which are to be processed. The Emir of Qatar addressed the UN General Assembly in September 2017 to draw attention to what he considered to be the impermissible, illegal act that was being engaged in by Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain. There's been complaint made by Qatar to the UN Security Council since early 2008. There have been incursions of airspace, allegedly by military aircraft from Bahrain. And on the 11th of June 2018, last year, Qatar filed a claim before the International Court of Justice invoking the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That convention was adopted by both the UAE and Qatar. And Qatar claimed that Qatari nationals were being targeted by the UAE in numerous ways, including the prohibition on continuation of studies by Qataris who were studying in the UAE, denying access to medical care in the UAE, denying access to property that Qatari nationals had in the UAE. There are, as I'm sure many of you are aware, multiple levels of connection between the different states. In Qatar, you will find that there are people who are of the same tribe as people in Saudi Arabia. So it's not a clear-cut situation in the sense of you're able to close down links and prevent people from engaging in interaction. You have families that have intermarried, and one of the measures that was causing considerable hardship was the inability of different members of families to meet each other in Bahrain, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia. And these were aspects of complaints that were being made by Qatar to the International Court of Justice. And on the 23rd of July 2018, the International Court of Justice, by 8 votes to 7, ordered 3 provisional measures at the behest of Qatar. And these were essentially, firstly, to ensure that the UAE authorities didn't obstruct the ability of family members to meet each other. Second, to ensure that Qatari students could continue their education. And third, a general order calling upon Qatar and the UAE not to aggravate the dispute. These proceedings before the International Court of Justice will continue, and the next round of pleadings is to be filed early next year. So assuming there's no diplomatic settlement, this could be ongoing for quite some while. Now, 2 other potential avenues of recourse for Qatar, 3. The first is using the WTO framework, as I mentioned. Qatar has instigated proceedings. Those proceedings are ongoing. Under the Chicago Convention and the ASTA Convention, where there is a right of access over airspace, which can be limited only in circumstances of national security and mustn't be discriminatory. Qatar has launched complaints. Those complaints have been considered by ICAO. Now the next stage is for the matter to be dealt with by the International Court of Justice, which sits in The Hague, to deliver a binding determination. That's ongoing. And last but by no means least, there is the potential for Qatar to invoke the jurisdiction of the Law of the Sea Tribunal, which sits in Hamburg, so far as access to territorial seas are concerned. So these are legal measures that can be undertaken by Qatar internationally. But what's been the response internationally politically? There have been active attempts to mediate. Kuwait has been very active in this regard, as has Turkey, Sudan, and notably in the European Union, France. There has been call for restraint on the part of the international community. The German authorities have identified how the dispute could escalate. Mercifully, that hasn't happened. There have been limited supporters of these measures, most notably Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel, and perhaps not surprisingly, given the somewhat unpredictable nature of President Trump, he has also, at some point in time, supported these measures. But then we have to also understand that the Secretary of State, pretty much immediately thereafter, said that Qatar's position was reasonable. So far as the United States is concerned, it would appear that the institutions, certainly the State Department, understands the position of Qatar and the UN permanent representative likewise. But overall, the international reaction has been such as to indicate that the measures that have been imposed on Qatar by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain are devoid of legal justification. And thus far, there's been no evidence in support of these measures. Certainly I haven't seen any, and I don't believe any has been filed in any court or tribunal. What about the UN response? Given that ultimately, as I mentioned to you at the outset, sanctions, if they are to be imposed, ought to be imposed through the centralized mechanism provided for by the United Nations, Chapter 7, Articles 39 to 41. So what's the UN position? The United Nations General Assembly spokesperson, 2 days after these so-called sanctions, stated that the UN, which means all of the United Nations member states as well, let's not forget, all 194 of them, is bound only by the sanctions list put together by the UN organs, such as the Security Council. We're not bound by any other lists. And it would appear that thus far there is no attempt on the part of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, to invoke the jurisdiction of the Security Council or the EU for measures akin to sanctions to be imposed at a multilateral level by international organizations. And what's the reaction of Qatar been? Immediately, on the day that the measures were imposed, the official Ministry of Foreign Affairs position was there was no legitimate justification and the measures were a violation of sovereignty. The Foreign Minister of Qatar, on the very next day, identified a preference for dialogue. And so far as the allegations were concerned, the Qatari ambassador to the US made Qatar's position clear that they were a fabrication and there was no proof. As I mentioned to you, nearly 2 years later, I'm not aware of any evidence having been circulated or provided to the Security Council, let alone entering the public domain. And what are the specific allegations? They relate to alleged sponsorship, support of terrorism, alleged sponsorship, support of political dissidents. Again, no evidence has been provided in support. Negotiations may take place, may not take place. There may be certain events that have occurred in the region of late that those of us who want to ensure that there is international peace and stability, may hope could lead to commencement of dialogue, constructive dialogue, and we can address how those measures could impact. But ultimately, at the moment, it seems as if there's an impasse. There's no indication, overt indication on the part of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, that these so-called measures will abate or diminish in the near future. And hence what we're left with is a situation where, at this moment, Saudi airspace, territorial waters of the UAE, Saudi, UAE, Bahraini airspace, territorial waters of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, are not accessible by Qatar Airways vessels which carry the Qatari flag. The land border is not accessible. Qatari nationals cannot, in truth, visit these states. And anybody who's not even a Qatari national who's seeking to fly from Qatar to these states can't go. There are no direct flights from Qatar to Dubai or Bahrain, let alone Saudi Arabia. So, for example, as I mentioned, our main office is in London. We have an office in Dubai, and before 5th of June 2017, the flight from Qatar to Dubai took less than an hour. And there were many flights during the day. But now to go to Dubai, it's necessary to go either to Kuwait or to Muscat and spend the best part of a day. In truth, it's actually easier for me to go to Dubai from London than it is from Qatar, which I know is absurd. So that's the practical effect. The practical effect has been diminished by Qatar, and one has to, and I'm telling you from the perspective of somebody who has an office there, staff there, who I spoke to, in fact, just minutes before I came here. And life is getting on as usual for people. Certainly for the first week or two, there were some constraints on supplies. But as happens in all situations, where once presented with adversity, you either succumb to the adversity or you develop and learn lessons from the adversity. So to Qatar's credit, Qatar's, and again, I'm not making any political points, you can see this from the facts, Qatar's been very restrained in its response. There is a gas pipeline supplying gas to the UAE. 30% of the UAE's gas comes from Qatar. These measures were imposed during the month of Ramadan, and it was open to the Qatari authorities to suspend the gas pipeline under the legal arrangements. I mean, I'm not going to say any more, but it was open to Qatar to do that, but Qatar didn't. All I would say is that, from my perspective, again, as I said to you right at the outset, I'm a passionate believer in public international law. Over the past nearly 30 years, I've undertaken work all over the world, and the situation that exists at the moment, not just in the region of the Gulf, but internationally, is very volatile. And there are many threats to the rule of law. The rule of law is being challenged repeatedly. And one hopes that in this situation, where it's clear that the authorities in Qatar have responded with respect, with restraint, and have actually adapted, so that whereas most of the dairy products were coming from Saudi Arabia, you now have dairy farms that have been established in Qatar. You have farms that have been established in Qatar. You have other channels that have been opened for fresh produce. Those in the construction sector who were relying upon fabricated steel and other materials coming from Saudi Arabia through the land border are now saying, we found cheaper suppliers. It's cheaper for us to do business. So actually the Saudis have done us a favor. In terms of Qatar Airways' operational capability, still flying all the routes apart from Dubai, UAE, UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi. So it's business as usual. What's been achieved by these measures? Well, I venture to suggest what the measures have done, perhaps, is expose the weakness of the GCC. The GCC, many people, I'm not expressing my own view, many people took the view that it was an ineffectual body to begin with. and its inability to be able to bring these parties together to achieve an amicable resolution perhaps indicates how weak it is, and maybe that its weakness is terminal, that the GCC in its present form can no longer continue to exist. What else does it indicate? It indicates that there are undoubtedly fault lines in the region, but those fault lines could also be attributed to rivalries. Anybody who's aware of how society in the region functions will understand that at its root there are tribal affiliations, and the outlook is somewhat tribal. And I don't mean this in a negative sense. I'm just telling you that's how it is. And there are rivalries. It's undoubtedly the case that there are rivalries. Qatar has been a very visible success story since the 1990s. Now, what has that generated? I'll leave it to you to guess. Are there any ways of breaking the impasse? Well, we know that a new foreign minister has been appointed in Saudi Arabia, and we know that there may be potential for developments to take place, but ultimately it seems that there are parties in a position to be able to effect a negotiated outcome, and perhaps the strongest party in this regard is the United States of America. And it would be a positive step for the occupant of the White House to call upon these parties to settle their differences. One hopes that will happen soon. But that's where I wanted to leave the overview and invite questions. I'm happy to discuss the specifics of the proceedings that are ongoing in the International Court of Justice and before the World Trade Organization, and the potential of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea to be invoked. But you'll find the detail in the presentation. You'll find the detail about the concept of force majeure, the concept of frustration as a matter of common law in the presentation. But if there are other questions or other observations, please do add your views, because that's what I'm sure will be interesting. Thank you.